Susan flies in the face of every talentless monster who's become famous.
There are moments in television history that stop the world, moments that cut through the noise, the cynicism, and the carefully constructed performances of modern entertainment, and remind us what it means to be truly, vulnerably human. The night of April 11th, 2009, was one of those moments. A 47-year-old woman from a small village in West Lothian, Scotland, walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in a slightly ill-fitting gold dress, her hair not quite styled, her nerves barely contained beneath a wide, hopeful smile. The audience smirked. The judges leaned back with folded arms. Simon Cowell, the most powerful and famously cold man in the music industry, raised an eyebrow that seemed to say everything the crowd was already thinking. And then she opened her mouth. What happened next didn't just change Susan Boyle's life. It changed Simon Cowell's. And it would take more than a decade for the world to fully understand just how deeply that one audition had burrowed itself into the heart of a man who had built an empire on being unbreakable. This is the story of an unlikely bond, a story about what fame truly costs, about what it means to discover someone extraordinary and then watch helplessly as the world you place them in begins to overwhelm them. And ultimately, it is a story about a farewell that brought one of entertainment's most guarded figures to the edge of tears, and perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, reminded him why music ever mattered in the first place. To understand Simon Cowell's reaction to Susan Boyle's farewell, you first have to understand what she represented to him from the very beginning. Simon Cowell, by 2009, had already cemented his reputation as the architect of modern pop music talent television. He had launched careers through Pop Idol, American Idol, and The X Factor. He had turned rejection into a theatrical art form. He was known for being brutally honest, commercially sharp, and emotionally impenetrable. Critics loved to hate him. Contestants feared him. The public was endlessly fascinated by him. But something shifted on that April evening. When Susan began singing I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables, Cowell's expression changed in a way television cameras captured with uncomfortable intimacy. The skepticism evaporated. In its place was something rare, genuine, unguarded astonishment. He leaned forward. His arms, which had been crossed defensively across his chest, slowly unfolded. By the time Susan reached the song's soaring climax, Cowell was no longer a television judge. He was simply a man, hearing something beautiful for the first time. After the performance, he described it as the biggest surprise he had ever had in his many years in television. He admitted openly that he had prejudged her, that he had expected very little, and that he had been profoundly wrong. For a man who rarely admitted to being wrong about anything, that statement carried enormous weight. Even in that early moment, it was clear that Susan Boyle had done something to Simon Cowell that very few people ever managed. She had caught him completely off guard and made him feel something he hadn't planned for. The audition clip spread across the internet with a speed that even today's viral culture would find remarkable. Within days, it had accumulated tens of millions of views. Within weeks, it had become one of the most watched video clips in internet history, eventually surpassing 100 million views. The world was transfixed, not just by Susan's voice, but by the collective reaction of everyone in that room, and most visibly, by the transformation on Simon Cowell's face. What the cameras didn't capture, at least not initially, was the devastating toll that sudden, overwhelming global fame was having on Susan Boyle behind the scenes. She had spent nearly 5 decades in relative obscurity in Blackburn, West Lothian. She had cared for her elderly mother, sung at her local church, and quietly nurtured a dream that most people around her had stopped believing in long ago. She was not prepared, and truly, no one could have prepared her for what happened after that audition. The weeks following her performance on Britain's Got Talent were, by any reasonable measure, a form of psychological assault. She was photographed constantly. Her private life was excavated and spread across tabloid front pages. Journalists camped outside her home. Every perceived flaw, every awkward interview moment, every slightly stumbling public appearance was dissected with a cruelty that the viewing public, in their adoration, rarely stopped to consider. The same world that had fallen in love with her voice showed very little interest in protecting the person it belonged to. By the time the Britain's Got Talent finale arrived, Susan Boyle was visibly unwell. Despite delivering another stunning performance, she came in second place, losing to the dance group Diversity. The result, combined with weeks of unrelenting pressure, proved too much. Shortly after the finale, Susan was taken to the Priory, a private hospital in London, suffering from exhaustion and what was described at the time as a stress-related illness. The woman who had moved the world to tears was herself in crisis, and the entertainment machine that had launched her into the stratosphere was ill-equipped to catch her when she fell. Simon Cowell later spoke about this period with a candor that surprised many people who knew him. In various interviews over the following years, he acknowledged that the entertainment industry, his industry, had not done enough to protect Susan Boyle. He spoke about the system's tendency to create extraordinary moments without adequately considering the human beings at the center of those moments. For a man whose public persona was built on an almost invincible confidence, these admissions represented something quietly significant. They suggested a conscience grappling with complicated questions about responsibility, fame, and the difference between discovering talent and truly supporting it. Susan Boyle's career, despite everything, flourished in the years that followed. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, released in November 2009, shattered records with breathtaking speed, selling over 2 million copies in its first week alone and going on to become one of the best-selling debut albums in music history. She became the oldest artist to reach #1 with a debut album, a record that stood as both a triumph and a gentle rebuke to an industry that had spent decades telling the world that youth was the only currency that mattered in music. Subsequent albums, including The Gift in 2010 and Someone to Watch Over Me in 2011, confirmed that her appeal was not a fleeting viral moment, but something far more enduring. Audiences around the world, particularly those who felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible, recognized themselves in Susan Boyle. She had become something greater than a pop star. She had become a symbol. Through this period, Simon Cowell remained a figure in the background of her story. He spoke about her in interviews with what can only be described as genuine pride, the kind that exists not in ownership, but in witnessing. He celebrated her successes publicly and, according to people close to both of them, maintained a warm personal regard for her that went beyond the professional relationship of judge and contestant. But the years also brought challenges that tested Susan's resilience in ways that even her most devoted supporters found heartbreaking to witness. In 2013, she received a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism that had gone unrecognized throughout her school years and well into her adult life. For Susan, the diagnosis was described as something of a liberation, a framework that finally explained a lifetime of feeling different, misunderstood, and out of step with the world around her. She spoke about it openly and with characteristic warmth, using her platform to advocate for greater understanding and acceptance of autism in all its forms. That same year brought the additional challenge of a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, requiring significant changes to her lifestyle and diet. Then came the devastating loss of her sister Bryony to cancer in 2015. Bryony had been one of Susan's most steadfast supporters, the kind of constant presence whose absence leaves a silence that nothing can quite fill. Susan grieved deeply and, for a time, withdrew from the public eye. The COVID-19 pandemic brought a further 2-year pause in her music career as she shielded carefully to protect her health. And then, in 2022, came the news that shook her fans most profoundly. Susan had suffered a minor stroke, the fear that she might lose the very gift that had defined her life, her voice, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet Susan Boyle did what she had always done in the face of adversity. She endured. She worked. She recovered. Her return to the stage at the venue where, 14 years earlier, she had first changed the world, was one of those moments that reminds you why live performance remains one of humanity's most emotionally powerful art forms. Standing before the West End cast of Les Miserables, the same musical whose most famous song had launched her journey, Susan Boyle sang, I Dreamed a Dream once more, and it was, by all accounts, extraordinary. She had been honest with her audience about the stroke, about the speech therapy, about the long road back to singing. There was no pretense, No carefully managed celebrity narrative designed to minimize the difficulty of what she had been through. Susan simply told the truth, as she had always done, and then she sang. In doing so, she reminded everyone in that room and everyone watching that the voice was still there, older now, perhaps carrying even more weight and meaning than it had when a nervous woman from Blackburn had first unveiled it to the world, but unmistakably present and achingly beautiful. It was in the context of this return, this late chapter of Susan Boyle's remarkable story, that Simon Cowell made remarks and gave interviews that many observers described as genuinely emotional. For a man whose emotional vocabulary in public settings had been so carefully controlled for so many decades, the shift was noticeable. He spoke about Susan in terms that went beyond the professional. He spoke about what she meant, not just to television or to the music industry, but to people, to ordinary people who had been told their moment had passed, their window had closed, their dream was no longer worth pursuing. People who knew Cowell well described witnessing something they had rarely, if ever, seen from him, a visible emotional response when speaking about Susan Boyle's journey. Not a theatrical performance of emotion, but the quieter, less controllable kind, the kind that arrives without invitation and refuses to be entirely suppressed, no matter how practiced you are at keeping it at bay. To understand why Susan Boyle's story affects Simon Cowell so profoundly, it helps to look more carefully at what he has said about her over the years, and to read between the lines of those statements. Cowell has spoken repeatedly about the way Susan's audition exposed the ugliness of prejudice, including his own. He has acknowledged that he, along with almost everyone else in that theater, had looked at her and made a series of snap judgments based on her appearance, her age, her background, and her manner, and had been comprehensively humiliated by those judgments. This is, for a man of his stature and self-regard, a remarkably honest thing to admit, and he has admitted it more than once, which suggests it continues to sit with him. But there is something else in his comments about Susan that goes deeper than professional humility. When Cowell talks about her, he frequently returns to the idea of what she represents for people who feel overlooked. He talks about her as a kind of proof that talent exists in unexpected places, that the filters we use to identify and cultivate ability are deeply flawed, and that the entertainment industry, for all its power, misses more than it finds. This is a complicated admission for a man who built that industry. It suggests a degree of self-reflection about the systems he helped create, and whether those systems serve art and human potential or simply serve commerce. The fact that Susan Boyle arrived not through those systems, but in spite of them, that she had been rejected repeatedly by the music industry before walking onto that stage, makes her success both thrilling and quietly damning. There is also, perhaps, something more personal in Cowell's response to Susan's journey. He has spoken in various contexts about the pressure of public life, the difficulty of maintaining a private self beneath a public persona, and the emotional costs of an industry that rewards performance above almost everything else. In Susan Boyle's story, with its brutal exposure, its mental health crises, its health struggles, and its long road toward something resembling peace, there are themes that may resonate beyond the professional for a man who has spent decades at the very center of entertainment's most unforgiving spotlight. It would be too simple to frame this story purely as a personal one between two people. Susan Boyle's journey has had measurable effects on the entertainment industry more broadly, and Simon Cowell's public reckoning with her story is part of a larger conversation that her career forced into the open. Before Susan Boyle, reality television's treatment of contestants, particularly those who were vulnerable or who became suddenly overwhelmed by fame, had attracted growing criticism. The format, in many of its iterations, had developed a troubling tendency to prioritize dramatic footage over human welfare. The gap between the experience of being on these shows and the support systems available to contestants was frequently enormous, and the consequences of that gap were sometimes severe. Susan Boyle's very public breakdown in 2009 and the subsequent reporting on the pressures she had faced during the competition forced a conversation about duty of care that the industry could no longer comfortably avoid. Producers, broadcasters, and the creators of talent formats were pressed to examine what responsibilities they bore toward the people whose lives and vulnerabilities they were essentially commodifying. Changes followed, though unevenly and imperfectly. More serious conversations about psychological support for contestants became part of the industry's evolving vocabulary. Mental health awareness began to be built, at least nominally, into the structures of major talent shows. None of this was sufficient, and the problems it sought to address are far from resolved. But the conversation would not have happened, or at least would not have happened as soon, without Susan Boyle. Simon Cowell, as one of the most powerful architects of the format, has had to sit with his own complicated relationship to those questions. His emotional response to Susan's later struggles and to her eventual farewell from the most intense period of her public life cannot be fully separated from this broader reckoning. When he speaks about her with something approaching grief, he is speaking not only about a woman he admires, but about a chapter of his own professional legacy that is more morally complex than simple celebration would allow. What does it mean for Simon Cowell to say farewell to Susan Boyle? Not farewell in the final, absolute sense. Susan Boyle is still here, still singing when her health allows, still beloved by millions around the world. But farewell to a certain version of her story. Farewell to the era of the world-conquering debut, the record-breaking albums, the relentless tour schedule. Farewell to Susan Boyle as the entertainment industry knew her at her peak. There is a particular kind of grief that accompanies the fading of someone who made you feel something profound and unexpected. It is different from ordinary loss because it is entangled with your memory of who you were when you first encountered that person, what they awakened in you, what they reminded you was possible. When Simon Cowell says goodbye to that chapter of Susan Boyle's story, he is in some measure saying goodbye to the part of himself that was caught off guard on that April evening in 2009. The part that forgot, just for a moment, to be calculating. The part that simply felt something and let it show. That is no small thing for anyone. For Simon Cowell, it may be one of the most significant things that has ever happened to him in a public setting. Those who have observed him speak about Susan in recent years describe a man who is genuinely moved, not performing emotion, not manufacturing a moment for the cameras, but experiencing something real and slightly inconvenient in its realness. He speaks about her legacy with a reverence that he reserves for very few things. He speaks about what she did for people who had been told their time had passed, and as he speaks, it is possible to see, if you look carefully, that he is one of those people. Not in the obvious sense. Simon Cowell has never been short of professional opportunity or success, but in the deeper sense of someone who encountered, unexpectedly, and against all his own defenses, a reminder of why any of this was ever worth doing in the first place. Susan Boyle's legacy in music and in culture is both simpler and more profound than the headline version of her story might suggest. The headline version is the fairy tale, the overlooked woman, the stunning voice, the record-breaking album, the global sensation. And that story is true and genuinely extraordinary. But the deeper legacy is something else. It is the conversation she started about prejudice and the way we categorize people based on appearance, age, and perceived social standing. It is the conversation she started about mental health and the responsibilities of institutions toward vulnerable individuals in their care. It is the conversation she started about autism and the millions of people who navigate the world with Asperger's syndrome, many of them undiagnosed for years or decades, as Susan was. Many of them misunderstood and underestimated in ways that left permanent marks. It is also the deeply personal impact she had on individual listeners around the world. The people who heard, "I Dreamed a Dream," and recognized in it something of their own buried hopes. The people who had been told they were too old, too plain, too different, too slow, too unlikely. Susan Boyle did not just have a beautiful voice. She had a voice that carried meaning beyond its technical qualities because of the story attached to it, because of the person it came from, and because of what that person's journey represented. Simon Cowell understands this, which is why his response to her farewell carries the weight it does. He knows that what he witnessed in 2009 was not simply a great audition. It was a cultural moment, and cultural moments of that magnitude come along very rarely in a lifetime, even for someone who has spent that lifetime in the business of creating them. Simon Cowell has seen a great deal in his years in the entertainment industry. He has launched careers and ended them. He has presided over moments of extraordinary talent and moments of memorable failure. He has been praised and vilified, celebrated and satirized. Through all of it, he has maintained the persona, the crossed arms, the raised eyebrow, the sharp tongue, the almost supernatural ability to remain unmoved by things that move everyone else. Susan Boyle moved him. She moved him on a stage in front of millions of people in 2009, and she has gone on moving him in the years since, through her struggles and her recoveries, through her grief and her resilience, through her stroke and her return to the stage, through all the chapters of a life that has been lived, as she would say herself, in full. When Simon Cowell breaks down in saying farewell to Susan Boyle, and the breaking down is not always in tears, but sometimes in something quieter, a softening of the voice, a pause before speaking, a look in the eyes that says more than the words. He is breaking down over something that deserved to break him down. He is breaking down over the reminder that the most extraordinary things are not always planned for. They arrive in gold dresses on Tuesday evenings in front of skeptical audiences, and they change everything, and you carry them with you long after the applause has faded. Susan Boyle taught Simon Cowell something that the entire machinery of the entertainment industry had never managed to teach him in all his years at its helm. She taught him that the thing that makes music matter is not the package it comes in. It is the truth inside it. And for that lesson, which came when he least expected it and hit harder than anything he had been prepared for, Simon Cowell has never quite been the same, nor has the world.